Thanks, Guillermo, and it's both a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this event to celebrate John's contributions. I want first to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri people, who've been custodians of the land which I stand for thousands of years, and acknowledge their and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As Guillermo said, I was one of John's PhD graduates I was at Monash, and in an earlier talk, there was some comment about how many logicians found their academic home in computer science, and I'm one of those. In fact, when I look back, I find I've contributed around 10% of John's math genealogy descendants, but my descendants are all in computer science and AI. When I started in computer science, it was with a very machine-to-machine oriented considerations, but over time, including collaboration, some of which I'll talk about today, with cognitive and social psychologists, I've focused more and more on human automation interaction. My current focus is on explainable AI, but I won't get to that. Though many of the technical things I'm going to talk about, or touch on anyway, are indeed coming from and directed to explainable AI. So let me make some observations first. So to be able to explain something, you need to be able to successfully explain, you need to be able to consider the audience. And even if you think about it from the point of view of a machine attempting to do explanation, even assuming a variety of sensory or other inputs, there's a fundamental underlying question as to how the internals of the machine might represent and reason with that information. And having started with a firm grounding in symbolic methods, I arrived at AI at a time when this was seen as a good thing to do. And I've continued in that vein and not been seduced by the currently popular attraction of data-driven methods. In this talk, I'm going to offer a very light overview of some technical results. There are a lot of references annotated on the slides, so you can think of the talk as a rather selective but animated literature review. But of course, in the spirit of the Festschrift, I'm going to intersperse this with some moments from John's own past, including some reflections on that reminiscences of logicians that indeed you mentioned, Guillermo. I'm going to start with an example from a completely different domain, from conjuring, a distinctly human-to-human activity, but one that relies on manipulation of beliefs and expectations. And so I'll be able to highlight some of the features that seem to be necessary to support interaction between machines and humans. So I'm going to start with a short video of a professional magician performing an old but clever trick, albeit in an informal setting. All right, now the sound should come through.
Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. We're good to go. We're rolling.
Michael Vincent. I'm with my coffee shop crew, and they've requested a miracle. So who am I to say no? All right, there we go. We always start off with the shuffle deck because it's the shuffle that brings chaos. All right, Chris. Yeah. You've probably seen magicians say, "Pick a card, any card." Okay. This one's different. Right. I just want you to cut the deck wherever you like. Right there? Okay, we're just going to mark the position, okay? Now, I've been asked many times, what's the most difficult thing that can be done with a deck of cards? Magician says, put a card, put it back, and then he finds it. Well, I want to share with you what I think is a really interesting concept. You've just cut the deck at a random spot, correct?
Yeah.
Now, do me a favor, just slide your finger in, slide the card out, but don't look at it. Okay. All right, splendid. Now, what makes this interesting is you've got no idea what that card is. But one thing we can agree on is somewhere in the pack, there are a few cards closely related to this one. Do you get that? So I thought it'd be interesting to use my intuition and sense of touch to try and distinguish a few things, okay? So here we go. First we'll give these another mix. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let me see. Do you know what, Martin? I'm going to go for this one right here.
Go on then.
Okay, we've got the Jack of Hearts.
Yep.
That's a good choice. Now, if I cut once, twice, 3 times, I've got a very good feeling about this card here. In fact, I think it's the Jack of Diamonds.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're doing quite well here. So that's 2 jacks, 1 more cut. Did we get lucky? The Jack of
Oh.
So think about this: 1 unknown card,
Yeah.
and 3 jacks. Do me a favour. I'm really hoping this is the missing spade, by the way.
It's gonna be, isn't it?
Fingers crossed. Take a look. Did we make it?
Show it to the camera.
It's close.
Do you realise you cut to the wrong card? Mind you, this is the highest card in the pack, right?
Yeah.
I did say it's one of the most difficult things to do with a deck of cards,
Yeah.
but here's the best part. I'm a magician, you see. Watch this. So just cut a bit of magic here.
Right.
And I think we call this
Oh.
match made in heaven. How about that?
Oh, very good.
Very good.
Did you like that?
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me just now try and link that back to my promise of reasoning about beliefs and expectations. So in this video, you saw a professional magician old trick dating back to over 100 years. And I'm not going to talk about the mechanics of the trick because the mechanics of tricks are deliberately kept secret amongst the magic community, but I'm going to talk about the manipulation of mental states. So here's a static summary of that same trick. The displayed cards, the 3, in this case are 7, so jacks in that video, and the hidden card, which was the ace in the video, turns out in this one to be a king. So let's just step through it. At the first stage, setting the scene, the spectators selected a card, not seen it, and it's the one that's under the keys there, face down, not seen. The performer selects 3 other cards from the pack, shows them, in this case 7s, places them face down, and then the performer confidently says, oh, well, you know, I've got the matched set of 4 from the same suit, and makes the declaration. At that point, the performer, who's been manipulating behind the scenes in effect, knows that at the moment of revelation, the spectator falsely believes that the performer believes the trick has failed. At the recovery step, when the 4, in this case, the 4 kings are displayed, we have the situation that not only did the performer know what the spectator falsely believed, at that point the spectator realizes it, and of course the performer intended that all along. And down the bottom of the screen is a kind of quasi-modal logic representation of the nesting of these mental attitudes. And what you can see is you've got intend, no, no, belief, belief. You've got a nesting of 5 depths of 5 levels of what sits in behind this particular relatively simple trick. So you may be wondering how I'm going to weave this back into a talk about research in AI. Turns out that I had the pleasure of working with an academic colleague, Wally Smith, who's also an amateur magician and a member of the International Science of Magic community, a group who explore very seriously how the expertise and in some cases the instincts of the art, craft and science of magic can be used to inform the study of human behaviour. And so as part of our work, we were able to get funded a project that drew on his understanding of magic. Of course, being a project funded by our research agent, National Research Agency, we weren't able to write it as being about magic. It was crafted as a project on strategic models of deception. And just to sort of highlight one of the publications from this that in effect kickstarted this project. The picture here is an image from one of the publications. And the point is that for tricks such as matching the cards, these are not illusionary tricks. These are conjuring tricks, no special effects, no tricks of lighting, no suggestive memory games, and so on. The creation of surprise lies in the gap between what seems naturally to be following from what the spectator is observing and what actually is occurring under the performer's control. On this figure, the blue line at the top represents the spectator's perceptions, what they perceive, what they observe. And the green line, or for the Australian audience, perhaps it's a teal line, represents the method path of actual events, building to the surprise gap, the red area, at the point of reveal. And in the reference paper, we do a close analysis of a particular trick, one simpler than matching the cards. And the idea is that it helps tease out the components of the types of evidence, different types of evidence relationships that are needed to sustain the audience's credibility over the unfolding of the alternate path. And so here we've been using logic as an expressive and precise representation language, but other than capturing properties, don't do any formal reasoning with that machinery. So we're in effect operating in what's sometimes termed the theory of mind, that's sometimes described as a process in which unobservable latent variables, goals, preferences, intentions, and so on, can be inferred from the available observable quantities. Now, we can write these things in a modal logic. They're very easy to build long formulae with high nesting levels. And indeed, in Professor Parik's talk of yesterday, there was mention not so much of the formalism, but of the nesting of beliefs and the way this played out in various contexts. In general discourse, it's been proposed that in most situations, 3 levels of nesting is a practical limit. But as we saw from the matching the cards example, at least implicitly, in some circumstances, we can operate with 5 nesting levels. And indeed, if you look into the literature, you can find examples where the reader these are from literature, let's say, where the reader needs to be able to comprehend quite deep levels of nesting. The O'Grady article that's referenced here plays out how sometimes an author needs the reader to comprehend even 6th or 7th levels of nesting in order to follow what's going on. So to give you a bit of a flavour of the rest of the talk, I'm partway through the scene setting, a bit more to go. And as I said, I've made a bunch of references available because I'm hoping that some of the articles will be of interest to some of you. Now, the next slide echoes the kind of Festschrift theme of historical reflections linked to John's activities. The first row, the 1970s row, Reminiscences of Logicians, comes directly from a series of talks that John organised not long after his arrival at Monash University. He brought together a number of key figures in logic, had them, as well as give serious talks over a glass of wine or two, to reflect on foundations in history. And the transcript has been published, and recently the audio was also released, and makes fabulous reading and listening. Some of the things that I recall, the reminiscences included Peter Hilton talking about Alan Turing, from time they shared at Bletchley Park, indeed anecdotes that I've used in my teaching in the theory of computer science to bring life to the sort of standard presentations of church Turing thesis. And in the last couple of days, there's been some commentary on the positioning of logic as a field relative to mathematics, and more recently computer science. And as I was looking over the transcript, a couple of quotes from Kleene and Mostovsky were particularly caught my eye. And it was Kleene who said in '74, there was a time when in the United States, there were many places where a mathematical logician was not really considered a respectable mathematician. And in response, Mostovsky says, I believe that all mathematicians look upon logic with suspicion. I'll leave others to comment if that's still a recurring theme. I arrived at the University of Melbourne in the early days of logic programming and found myself transitioning from math to computer science, surrounded by people such as the three pictured here, who are very much emerging international leaders in the theory and practice of logic programming. So it was a really great place to land because my home discipline of logic seemed to fit in quite well, even though I really didn't know much about programming at all. And I was also extremely fortunate that not long after that, there was a major stimulus of industrial innovation in so-called intelligent systems research that was heavily invested in by our Victorian state government. And that industrial focus brought resources, attracted people, and was a significant stimulus to research with applications that continues today. One of the key individuals, Mike Georgiev, an expat Australian working at Stanford and then SRI International, was attracted back to Victoria to start up a company called the Australian Artificial Intelligence Institute, AAI, as a private research and development organisation, attempting to echo some of the activities that were more popular in the US. Individuals within that company, such as Anand Rao and Andrew Lucas, stayed for a while and then moved on in their own directions. Mike himself moved to found a successor company, Agentis, and then subsequently another company, Precedence. So just briefly, the AAI research focused on how to mimic rational behaviour in humans as a way to build reactive goal-directed computer systems with a focus on achieving multiple objectives in complex dynamic environments. And the market sector they were targeting was aerospace and defence, and with the support of engineers and scientists at the Australian Defence Science Organisation at the time, the scientists were struggling with the problems of building complex simulations of air mission scenarios. And they found the approach that Mike and others brought of being able to represent and reason in terms of cognitive attitudes, such as beliefs and intentions, very attractive, and were able to deploy real systems in that way. One of the other companies, AOS, earlier days called Agent-Oriented Software, they started up in 1997, continued the development of agent programming environments, and still going today with more of a focus on autonomous ground vehicles than air vehicles, though they did have an early play into air vehicles. And the third company highlighted here, also with colleagues who had been working in fact, in AAI, they commenced in 2008, and they're currently active in natural language support for the vision impaired. So that work back in the 90s really has had a very significant flow-on effect. And underpinning, but in a kind of loose way underpinning, was the work on theory, which is depicted in the bottom half right-hand side of that slide. Anand Rao, who I mentioned, who was a senior member at AAI, now at PwC in the US, he developed a highly influential strand of theoretical work on temporal modal logics. These are known as BDI logics. And the ideas behind those, which came from much earlier work from Michael Bratman and Martha Pollack, were infused into the architecture of the programming systems, the so-called BDI architectures. At no point did people believe that they were genuinely mimicking human reasoning, but there was a sufficient proxy for that this was able to build systems that were genuinely useful and able to be debugged. There's an interesting knowledge engineering story there, but that's for another time. So in terms of building systems that allow the interaction of agents that hold these kind of data structures in terms of thought of in terms of mental attitudes, I'm talking about modal temporal logics. I don't need to go on and on about the trade-off between tractability and expressibility. There's a clear gap between, if you like, theory and practice, but nevertheless, people have been able to build systems that are useful. So I just thought I'd focus for a moment on one piece of work that I was involved in. And this is a piece of work studying the concept of common ground. And it's work in collaboration with a senior social psychologist at the University of Melbourne, Yoshi Kashima. The collaboration itself came about, as they often do, after a series of, if you like, serendipitous events, a mix of informal interactions, a variety of disconnected coffee conversations, and finally some energetic and opportunistic follow-up. I think that captures some of the types of collaborations that have been referred to over the last couple of days. The team itself, Yoshi, the social psychologist, been working on notions of common ground, had deep knowledge of that literature from psychology, and two other logicians who had a knowledge of modal and dynamic logics. And then the glue was a super energetic and very talented PhD candidate, who indeed had come from Germany as a master's student and stayed on to do a PhD. The context was to take the concepts of common ground, as had been informally captured in a variety of literature, and infuse them in two ways. One with the logic representation, of which, of course, there had been some already, but also to take some of Yoshi's ideas that took common ground in the context of joint activity as being very much more multifaceted than had been captured in other definitions. And so, without going into the details of the symbols, many of you will be able to read these at a glance because they're very familiar to you. But what the paper does is, firstly, it limits itself to KD45. Of course, there are all sorts of obstacles to that in the sense of practical application. Doesn't deal with logical omniscience, but we do draw out, as others do, the distinction between belief and acceptance, and then start to infuse the notions that, as I said, Yoshi focused on, of context dependence. And what you want to be able to do is not enforce, as it were, subgroup inheritance. And so the distinction between belief and acceptance gets that at one level. And then by introducing notions of context, which could be subgroup context or activity context, then you seek to replicate those properties, which we were able to do. But as well, we were able to introduce a formal notion called salient common ground, which went one step further in capturing Yoshi's intuition than had been done before. And this was, I think, a very nice example of how the precision enforced by working in a logic language allowed a sort of type of care that led to a bunch of definitions. and indeed in a bunch of properties, no paper is complete without a table of comparisons to other work and so on. But here's a piece of work that was very much focused on expressiveness to the without considering the, well, without tractability. Okay, so there's a little bit of motivation, a little bit of technical content, and now to my interlude. So let me take you back to 1994. John Crossley, many visitors coming through, a magnet for talented folk. On this occasion, John organised a 2-day workshop program in the top half of the screen. Chris Ash, who was mentioned yesterday, very fine mathematician at Monash, and Alan Robinson, bottom right, very, very well known, of course, particularly to this community for his work on unification and automated theorem proving. But I thought I'd just pause while you read the abstract of John's talk, A Biased History of My Involvement in Logic and Computing. I'll leave you to read on. Seems to me something we can check with John later, but it seems to me something he might say today, let alone 1994. The workshop closed with a debate, and by some miracle of organisation, I have retained and managed to locate the video that went for an hour. I've made a couple of short extracts, and I'm going to share one with you in a moment.
Speaking to the affirmative, the programs are better than proofs. Professor Chris Wallace, Julia Knight.
All right. I think I've got, and somebody call out if I don't, do I have the sound?
Affirmative, the programs are better than proofs. Professor Chris Wallace, Julia Knight.
So Chris Wallace, one of Australia's most prominent computer scientists, foundation chair at Monash University in 1968 when he was 34. So he commenced shortly before John and was young, but not as young as John. Julia Knight, a logician who will be known to many of you.
Speaking to the negative, that proofs are better than programs, Alan Robinson and Liz Sonenberg.
So Alan needs no introduction. And as you'll see, this is a very, very serious debate.
Now to make the case for the negative, Alan Robinson.
Now, what do we mean by proof? A very good question. I think it's fair to point out, as Professor Wallace did, that the kind of paltry proofs that come out of today's methodology really don't impress anybody very much. And what we really want are the kind of proofs that are real proofs, where the object is to convince and to persuade. And we really need a methodology for those. That's the kind of proof we should be studying. That's the kind of proof that one can be proud of. And I've just jotted a few ideas here down, if I may, in a debate, fairly make use of this. Some advanced, I must pick that up, yes. We were about to hear, I think, from Professor Wallace, a very fine example of argumentum ad hominem, which is where essentially you discredit the opponent by throwing mud at him, because there he was, you see, caught without his tie, and he noticed that not all of us were so careless as to come unprepared. So I feel, at least I deserve a point for wearing my my only tie, but I lose half a point because there was a big super stain just here, which I actually washed off in the intro. So, I mean, if you study the methods by which real proofs take place in the law courts and so on, and I must say in the mathematics seminar room sometimes, you can find examples. For example, of argumentum per vituperationem, which Girard, for example, is an extreme master at. You simply anticipate objections from the opponents, if there should be any, God forbid, and you pour contempt and ridicule upon them. And disgust, and you say, you know, what is it, bad taste, bureaucracy, you say, and you get away with it. This is very closely related to argumentum per terrorem, where you try to intimidate the opposition, and you say things in mathematics anyway. You say it is clear that, and if it isn't clear, well, you feel a little bit ashamed of saying, I don't see that, sir. And I've done that, and I have been squashed many times in seminars. You don't see that? Good God, you know? And so you back off, and you can do it either just by refusing to follow an invitation to see it right away, or else admit that you're not smart enough to do so, or you can sort of, you can be hit by one of these moments, as I always seem to be, and you just have to go on and sort of shake your head and continue as best you can.
Speaking for
as I say, a very serious debate. In case you're wondering, I'll come right back at the end. I will explain what happened at the end of the debate. Oops. Okay, so as I transition back from 1994, I just wanted to take a moment to comment again on the collaboration theme in my talk title of Logics and Collaboration. On this slide, I've highlighted some of the both direct and indirect influences on my own research directions. And as I commented earlier, progress is always a combination of the talents of those one works with closely over time and the work of those you admire and find inspiring in various ways. And again, if I reflect on the talks I've heard over the last couple of days, I think those are themes that resonate. I don't want to go in detail about either these individuals or the work, but I just thought it was a nice complement to the debate video to bridge back to some more technical work. So interested in logics, reasoning about change, and a theory of mind perspective with a view to human-machine interaction. From an expressiveness point of view, dynamic epistemic logics seem an obvious direction. I don't need to say much about this because as luck would have it, the subsequent two talks this morning, depending on where you are, will deal with some aspects in great detail. But simply to say that the underlying idea is models and possible worlds that allow explicit manipulation of change over time. Unfortunately, highly expressive as they are, we get intractability almost for free. Which immediately raises the question of how to achieve some combination of the expressiveness without sacrificing the tractability. And in particular, there's been a lot of work in the last decade or so on epistemic planning. So planning captured as, given my current state and a desired state, and knowledge of pre and post conditions of available actions, what sequence of actions will enable me to get from one to the other. Clearly a search problem at minimum. And so given that, if you like, plan verification is effectively a piece-based complete problem, it's completely unsurprising that plan existence in the multi-agent context is undecidable. And so one is drawn to the idea of trying to identify decidable fragments of this. You want sufficient expressivity to be able to capture interesting problems and sufficient tractability to be able to execute them. A little bit reminiscent of the work on automated theorem proving and the development of Prolog that relied on Horn-Clause logic as a natural representation framework. And again, I'll just turn very briefly to one piece of work that we did through a funded project, and two extremely talented postdocs, one from Canada, one from Italy, that we're able to attract into to work with us for a small number of years. And so it's a planning task in this mode of epistemic logic. And the particular restrictions that we imposed were of bounded depth of nested belief and no disjunction. Clearly, that instinctively helps to control explosion, combinatorial explosion. Turned out to be, building on work from other logicians, turned out to be just a kind of sweet spot. And what we were able to do was, in effect, build a syntactic mechanism that, in effect, matched the semantics that we wanted. And so that there's a compilation process of axioms and belief revisions into syntactically characterized effects, largish, but not unbearably large space to manipulate. And it turns out that this shape of knowledge base is usefully expressive. And again, the paper spells this out in a bunch of domains. They're not realistic domains such as I was referring to earlier, the emission modeling or an autonomous ground vehicle, but they are the types of benchmark domains that are used widely in the planning community. So screenshot of a sort of performance table from the paper, one of the papers, and then an emphasis that here's an example of taking logics and adjusting with a focus on tractability while retaining a reasonable level of expressiveness. But theory of mind reasoning, while there's been a good level of work in logic-based approaches to it, there's even more work in a whole wide range of mechanisms that are not logic-based. And I would be remiss if I didn't leave at least the flavor of those. So there's, unsurprisingly, a variety of probabilistic and related techniques to try and capture elements of human reasoning that are both expressive and mechanistically achievable. Okay, so just to kind of begin to wind up, let's go back to the debate. So Chris and Julia have had their say, Alan and I have had their say, and we're at the sum up stage.
Despite this difference, the case remains obvious. As I got to the point of saying, that
All right.
despite this difference, the case remains obvious. As I got to the point of saying,
Value is a quantity of type money. By any scale, therefore, programs win hands down. After 3,000 years of making proofs, you still can't sell one. I'll tell you, the market is distinctly bearish. Bill Gates did not become a multi-billionaire by proving anything, unless you could say he proved a point, and the point he proved was that programs is what matter.
I opened our case by stressing the probity and fine standards that my colleague and I were going to honour. And I must tell you that I've never heard a more brilliantly argued case than our opponents have put. And therefore I have no compunction but to accept this overwhelming proof that programs are better, and I even see why this is the case. It's because, isn't it, that a good proof is really the sign of a good program which is generating that proof, as you say, inside the computer that we all are. And I think some of us are misled into thinking that programs are sleazy and filthy and so on, by the idea that a computer is such a simple thing as a black box with a few states and it clicks around between them. It's a rather humiliating thing to be thought such an entity. And of course we don't like to think of ourselves as being computers in that sense, but no avoiding the conclusion that we really are, where the scale is enormous, but we really are, and what we are doing is simply obeying some kind of program. And what a program it is. And therefore I have no choice but to invoke the parliamentary privilege of crossing the floor of the House and joining the party of
Congratulations.
Sorry, Liz. Enjoyable indeed. John, I'm not sure how much of that you do remember. So to close. All right. So to close. So the hypothesis underpinning much of the work I've been describing is that the right level of abstraction for modeling cognitive processes and phenomena is the sort of cognitive attitude level. A companion hypothesis is that humans and robots or AI systems interact better when they share similar representations, and indeed when the system can represent and reason about the perspective of the human. These are, of course, only hypotheses, but there is a growing body of empirical support in the sense of successful systems. And my almost final comment is a quote from Nobel awardee Daniel Kahneman from an interview on a topic he terms adversarial collaboration. And I quote, "People don't change their minds. The power of reasons is an illusion. The belief will not change when the reasons are defeated. The causality is reversed. People believe the reasons because they believe the conclusion." Food for thought. And in conclusion, I hope that in this talk, I've illustrated some of the influence on the next generation of John's boundless energy and demonstrated personal values around reaching out and working with others. Hence my title, Logics and Collaboration. Thank you, John, and thank you to the audience.